why don't you start off just by kind of giving an introduction of who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Well, I'm British. I've been in Japan about 25 years. I came here originally as a British diplomat. I was a British government official for about 10 years. And then after some time at the British Embassy in Tokyo, I moved to the private sector and to the pharmaceutical industry. And I've been in the pharmaceutical industry ever since, so about 18 years or so. And I've worked for a number of different companies, Japanese and Western. And then last year, I moved to Senkora, Japan, to establish their market access and pricing function, which is consulting support for pharmaceutical companies in Japan.
Awesome. And you're an author yourself, right?
I am, yes. I have my own books on the shelf back here. Yeah, those are historical fiction. They're novels set in 1860s Japan about a British diplomat, a fictional British diplomat.
Okay.
At the time.
So diplomacy is really part of your continued interest, but also your background as well.
I guess so, yeah. And certainly Japan has been a big part of my life, and I'm a big fan of Japanese history, I guess.
So what inspired you to come over to Japan?
Well, I originally taught English in Osaka before I joined the British government as an official, between my undergraduate and my master's degree. And to be honest, I had no particular interest in Japan when I first came, but living for 2 years in Osaka gave me that interest. So once I went back to the UK and became a government official, I was interested for any opportunity to come back to Japan, and one came up, and that's what brought me then to Tokyo, which is kind of the second time I was in Japan.
Cool. So as you've transitioned from a career in diplomacy to a career in business and a very important role in just a second as I turn my aircon off here, a very important role in business, because as a market access professional, you're on the front lines of this very important role in opening up doors in the government to get therapies to market faster and in better ways. So how have you, as a leader, what have you learned in terms of communication and not just selling yourself as a candidate, but as a professional in market access with a diplomacy background? What have been some of the kind of key principles that have helped you be an effective leader in the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, I mean, I think it helps when engaging with government. I think it helps that I come from government myself. I think that that's always been part of how I sell myself in the industry, and I think it's part of how I do my job. I mean, I started my British government career doing North Sea oil development, where I would be on the government side of the table, and the other side of the table would be Shell and BP and Exxon and these companies. And although the content is different, the structure is very similar to a pharmaceutical price negotiation. So I don't find it very difficult to put myself in the mind of a Ministry of Health official. And I think in any negotiation, it's an advantage to be able to see it from both sides. In fact, really, it's essential. In that sense, I sell myself a bit, as I'm not a lifelong pharmaceutical industry person or only pharmaceutical industry, and that other career history I have is an advantage in what I do these days.
So you know what they want to hear and what are the buttons to push.
I hope so, yeah. I mean, there's obviously cultural differences between the UK and Japan, but actually I think there's more similarities between government officials in different countries, and their incentives are not the same as those in the private sector, and you have to understand that. So I think I do, and I certainly, I present myself as someone who can talk to government effectively.
Interesting. So could you expand that a little bit more in terms of what are those principles and those fundamentals, or even the formula, if you will, as to how those oil and gas companies would communicate that you've found to have parallels to the pharma industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think because in both those situations, whether it's oil and gas development or pharmaceutical development, both sides of the negotiation have the same goal. They want this to work. And in that sense, it's slightly different from a more purely commercial negotiation where, if you can get the price down, then you gain and they lose. It's not a zero sum negotiation at all. And the other side are not your enemy. They're not the opponent. you are trying to find a solution that works for both and will bring the drug to market or will allow the oil field to be developed. So it's more collaborative or partnership type of negotiation than a purely commercial negotiation, I think. Because the government, in the end, it's not, of course, the numbers matter, but it's not only about the bottom line. The government doesn't quite have a bottom line in the same way. And I think one of the big lessons I learned as a government official is that the government side need a narrative. It's not just about the number. They need to explain this to their stakeholders. So the officials need to explain it to their bosses. They need to explain it to the politicians, to the media. Did you give too much away? Did you do the wrong thing? Were you, bullied by the companies, whatever? You need a narrative, and you need to help them with that narrative. And I think that's not always obvious to people who've spent their entire career in the private sector. But because I've been on the other side, I know that's what you need to give government to help them come to a mutually acceptable outcome.
Right. What has there been an aha moment in your earlier career where you learned how to do that?
Well, I think it was a revelation because I came from the government side. To me, what the government officials needed was quite obvious, I suppose, and you don't really think about it yourself. And then I joined the private sector, and I realised that it wasn't obvious to many on the company side, and that they were thinking as if the government is another pharmaceutical company where you might be trying to do a partnership arrangement, and it's not the same mindset. So I think it was quite a shock to me that this information I had, this understanding I had, that I didn't think was very unusual or special. I mean, you don't need to be a genius to have it. You just had to have that background. But it was a revelation that it wasn't widespread in the industry because it's not obvious if you haven't been on the other side of the table.
And so does that go beyond, creating this narrative, which is really important, as you say, for them to be able to pass on to another stakeholder that's in a way that's transferable and it's clear and it's objective and tangible? Does it go beyond that? Is there like a tool or a framework that you could pass on to people?
I'm not sure about a tool or framework, but I think that concept of narrative, as opposed to focusing only on numbers and on the technical side of it, is fundamental. And I think there's certain principles around that. I don't know if that counts as a framework, but I think one is that the government side need a narrative. The other, as I mentioned, is that they're not the enemy. Japanese Ministry of Health, I know, these are very smart people. They're reasonable people. They're trying to do the best for the Japanese government, for the country, and they're trying to understand the private sector side as well. And they want innovation. They want new products into Japan. So I think understanding that you need to give them a narrative, understanding that you need to respect them and to try and understand their perspective as well. Those are just fundamental principles.
Thank you. And in the past, say, 5 years or so, you've led a very pivotal negotiation with the government on pricing for, is it Wegovy at Novo Nordisk?
Yes.
Are we allowed to talk about that?
Okay.
Okay. So if we talk about a major product that is in a space that doesn't necessarily have a precedent, such as Wegovy, at a big global pharmaceutical company, such as Novo Nordisk, you pulled quite a great effort, of course, a team effort, but ultimately you got the government to recognize value of that. What are the principles that helped you to get that across the line?
Well, I think the main principle when you're bringing a product in a new therapeutic area, and particularly one that's maybe potentially controversial, maybe not well understood, the trick really, I think, is don't treat the pricing exercise as purely a pricing exercise. If you treat it as a technical pricing process only, your chances of success are much lower. What you need to think more widely about education. So there's a kind of you need to bring in the communications function of your company. This is educating the media, partly so they don't write inaccurate stories and unnecessarily cause problems. Reasonably enough, business journalists cover lots of areas. They're not experts in your therapeutic area, so you need to make sure they're very that the journalists are well educated. You need to educate government officials and politicians about this new therapeutic area and the issues around it. Yeah, and then I think, and so that then brings in, it's not just communications, it's also public affairs as well. You need to be talking to officials and politicians and listening to any concerns they have and addressing them. And so there's a kind of whole background kind of educational effort that sits behind then the pricing negotiation, and that maybe wouldn't be necessary for a well-established therapeutic area where there are existing therapies. But when you're doing something new, you can't just come in with a pricing submission document and expect this to necessarily go well.
So it really goes back to knowing who you're talking to, and whether it's selling yourself for an opportunity or selling your product to the government for support, knowing which audience you're talking to and how to tailor your message appropriately to get the response that you're looking for.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And how you talk to a journalist is going to be different from how you talk to a politician or how you talk to a Ministry of Health official and so on. That's right. And they have different concerns, and you have to listen to concerns. It's legitimate for people to have questions and concerns.
Yep. And you're also an expert on entering new companies, because you've made quite a few bold moves yourself, including some that were very opportunistic, right? Such as joining Bayer to lead FPA in Japan, European Federation of Pricing and
Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations.
Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. So the past couple of years, there has been an unprecedented number of professionals who have had to, sometimes by choice and not by choice, change companies, especially in the pharmaceutical industry because of patent cliffs and downsizings and things like that. So having gone through multiple transitions, what would you say are some of the keys to success when landing into a new company to get off to a strong start?
Yeah, I think, it's inevitably going to be, there's going to be some element of shock. It depends exactly how big a change it is. If you change from, say, one big European pharmaceutical company to another big European pharmaceutical company, there'll be differences, but they're not as big as if you change from, say, a big Japanese pharmaceutical company to a very small, basically American culture company, which is actually what I did when I moved from Eisai to Shire. Shire was not officially American, but it was in effect an American company, even though it's legally registered elsewhere. And the culture shock then was much bigger. But I think whatever the move is, there's going to be some element of culture shock, and you need to not blame yourself for that. It's not because you're failing somehow. It's just because this is an inevitable part of the process. So I think just understand there's going to be some culture shock. And then also, the worst thing you can do, I think, is that mindset of, well, that's not how we did it at my previous place. You need to stop that. It's inevitably going to happen inside your own head sometimes. I never communicate it like that. And also, of course, there will be less positive lessons from your previous employer that maybe you can bring to your new employer, but it needs to be sort of phrased and thought of in a careful way, without comparing them directly, I think. And you need to commit emotionally to your new employer and not have half your brain still in your old company.
Right. So expect there's going to be differences and embrace those.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. But also understand, your background in another company is a positive. I moved from one company to another where the company I'd left had a very strong culture and system of working with patient groups. And I moved to my new company, which I would say was not as good in that. And it was a great advantage because I had these kind of lessons and experiences I brought with me, but I didn't mention that's where I was getting the ideas from. But essentially, I imported ideas from my previous company, and it was a positive. I didn't sit there thinking we don't work with patient groups as well as my previous employer. I treated it as an opportunity I got useful experience that allowed me to help improve the new company.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Now, I understand you have read the book by yourself,
I have indeed. Yes.
Thank you. So I'm curious to hear, what did you like the most about Sell Yourself Like a CEO?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that stood out to me most. One is kind of at the strategic level, which I suppose is the main message of the book, which is really to be proactive and take ownership of your own career. And I've been working for a long time now, and I've kind of half worked that out myself, but I've never quite, seen it put so clearly. And it was a great reminder to take ownership of, instead of being passive. I mean, I think many of us are somewhat passive, and I think maybe even more so in Japan. People can be passive about their own career as if it's something that happens to you, and so a kind of mindset of I'm the boss of this. I mean, CEOs themselves don't control the environment. Lots of things happen to companies CEOs can't control, but they're still the people in charge of the company. And so, yeah, things will happen that I can't control, and maybe sometimes negative things. But I'm still in charge of my career. That doesn't change it just because some external shock happens. And I think that's just a great mindset. And I've never seen it, I kind of half worked out myself, and I've occasionally heard similar things said, but I've never seen it put quite so clearly in a way that resonated quite so much. So that was great, I think. So at the kind of strategic level, that was the main point I took. Perhaps more tactically, the one that hit home for me was about interviews, where I kind of was kicking myself because I realized I've not always done this, which is really of course I've done preparation for interviews. I'm kind of prepared, but that really thinking it through properly, and again, trying to take control of the process and make sure you're in as good a shape as you can possibly be for every step of the interview process. I'm not sure I've always done that, and I thought that was really powerful, the way that came through in the book. That every step you should be fully prepared for.
So what's something from that interview preparation, navigating the job market to attract offers, what's something that you took away that'll help you feel more confident about in the future?
Yeah, I'm just looking slightly at the book. Yeah, I mean, I think, you talked about, I think I hope I've got this right, but I think it talked about the kind of to and fro in the interview, and so that kind of being ready to handle certain questions and certain topics more. I mean, I think I've always done the preparation, like, I read the company website and things. I think these things, and then sometimes you think you've done the preparation, but that more almost, I mean, this is what I think elite sportsmen do, where there's a lot of, I forget the word they use for it now, but where they're envisaging the actual situation and how you deal with it in advance, so that it's not mentally new for you when you're there. And I think that with interviews, where you'll really think, if they ask me this, if they challenge me on this, and really go, like, almost play the game, play the interview out in your head in advance. I mean, that kind of preparation, I think that kind of thinking in that way was kind of triggered by reading the book. It's not enough just to read the company website and then turn up and see how it goes. You need to be a bit more proactive, and not be afraid to kind of sit there and think how this might go, or even how it might go if it starts getting difficult and thing, and then how you'd and then maybe you never need that preparation because it all goes fine, but at least you're ready.
Yeah. Yeah, just like Michael Phelps, he visualized himself
Yeah,
winning
that's
that
right.
race. And even though the goggles fell off his head, if I'm not mistaken, he still won the race because he was prepared for it.
Yeah, that's right. It's exactly that sort of mindset. I mean, we may not be elite sportsmen, but we can still do our best.
And I think this is particularly true for the passive candidates out there who aren't proactively seeking a new opportunity, but they are having a meeting, whether it's an interview or a casual meeting. It's very easy to show up unprepared because they have
Yeah.
nothing to lose, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's where I've not always got it right in the past. Obviously, when you're really actively pursuing a particular job, then you tend to prepare pretty well. But it's the ones where you're exploring and you're not so sure, like that it's easy not to be fully prepared for that kind of interview, and that's obviously a mistake, because you shouldn't damage yourself in that way.
Yeah. So remembering every meeting is a first impression, and doing that little bit of prep, and just having some intention, right? Whether it's the thorough, full-on preparation and following the complete workbook or not, and just thinking about, what do I want to get out of this meeting? How do I want it to go? How do I want to present myself? Just that little tweak can make all the difference.
That's right.
Selling yourself can be a bit of an allergic word to a lot of people, right? Sales, selling
Yeah.
yourself. But what do you think is the biggest misconception people have about selling themselves, and how does this book challenge that?
Yeah, well, I think there are cultural differences. I mean, if I can say, I mean, I think as a Brit, I mean, I think in general it probably comes easier to Americans to talk about sell yourself than it does to Brits. I'm not sure where Canadians come in, Ryan. You're maybe similar to Brits, I know, or
Debate.
somewhere between Americans and Brits. And then I think the Japanese are even further along the spectrum of kind of not wanting to sell them. You know, selling yourself feels a bit arrogant, and it doesn't fit in the culture as well as you know. I think some cultures are just better at it, or it make people tend to be more relaxed about it. So just finding a way to overcome that reluctance to, obviously you don't want to sit in an interview boasting, but that way of positively explaining yourself without your kind of cultural reserve getting in the way, talking about achievements and stuff. This is not natural for Japanese. It's not natural for British people either. It's kind of seen as somewhat tasteless to talk about your achievements. But so I think this is a good example of where work this through in your mind in advance so that you're comfortable with how you're going to talk about your achievements, even if you don't really use the word achievements or you're not comfortable with that. But find a way to get comfortable with selling yourself, even if that isn't the vocabulary you use to yourself.
Yeah, Simon, one of the triggers that got me past a mental block of writing a book on this, or creating a resource around this, rather. I see it more as a resource for people than a book, because it isn't a 300 or 400 page novel, and all due respect to such authors. But I was in a Chamber of Commerce meeting here in Tokyo, watching a presentation on medical reps, sales reps in the pharmaceutical industry, and scores of how doctors rated those pharmaceutical companies on how well they value those medical reps. And there was one particular company that clearly stood out on the ranks. And the reason was because the doctors mentioned about how they felt that medical reps from that company were honest and factual about how they shared information about the product. And so that struck me and really ties into why authenticity is really the stage for everything else. It's not about boasting or bragging or being arrogant, which is often how selling yourself can feel like, right? Just like this pen exercise. Oh, it's amazing. No. It's about finding the genuine connection with the customer. So that's what I hope this book accomplishes at a strategic level, and then delivers the tools to do that. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. I mean, the book does talk about being evidence-based, and I think that's a good way as well to overcome some of the cultural reserves that some of us might have, where if you're talking about facts, this isn't boasting. If you're just talking about, you can just say this is what happened, and it's you're not saying I did a great job. You're just saying this is the result, and to bring things down to facts in a good way, take some of the emotion out of it and makes it just a more kind of rational, logical argument you're making.
So if you think back to yourself in your earlier career, what is one piece of advice from Sell Yourself like a CEO that you wish you had known earlier in your career?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to that main strategic message, which is about take ownership of your own career. I mean, I think when I look back, I've always been I've never done what's in the book, which is the think where you should be in 5 years. And I mean, of course, I could have done that, and then different things would happen, and the plan would never have evolved as expected. But that's still fine, I think, because there's value in it, even if it isn't what happens. But I think having that kind of medium term perspective, and then ownership of how you might achieve your medium term goals, that would have been good. But I think, like a lot of people, I think I was too reactive and too passive for large parts of my career.
Now, you've also been a hiring manager in Japan here, and you've worked for US, European companies. So the candidates you're looking for are bilingual, local residents, which are predominantly Japanese here in Japan, of course. What has been your biggest frustration as a hiring manager in, you see a great CV, but you interview them and maybe it doesn't live up to your expectations? After all, only one person can get the job. But what's been your experience as a hiring manager, and where candidates fall short?
I think and so this may be a Japanese cultural trait, but I think because Japanese are often very reserved and very formal, that they don't allow their personality to show through in the interview. Ultimately, you want to see the personality because you want to know how they'll fit in the team, how they'll cope with the stresses of the job, and you want to get a feeling for the type of person they are. That's very important. It's not just the experience and so on you can see written on a CV, but in an interview, you want to get that feeling of real personality. And I think it's not only Japanese who do this, but many people, because then maybe they're a bit nervous, it's a formal situation, you're kind of restraining your real personality, and then the interviewer can't necessarily quite see who you are. Obviously, sometimes your personality is not going to fit, but if that's the answer, then it's better not to get the job. But I think demonstrating the sort of person you are is a good, and on average will be a good idea in interviews, and the interviewer will appreciate it because they'll get a feeling for who you are, not just what your resume says.
Thank you for sharing that. Would you recommend Sell Yourself Like a CEO to others?
Yeah, absolutely. I think because I have published a couple of books myself, I mean, I was very impressed with the physical nature of the book. It's a very nice book. It's very easy to read. I mean, even physically, like the font, the paper, the way you use subheadings. It's just a book that's made to maximize the chance of the information going into the reader's head. So I think I think it's really impressive, and I wish, to be honest, I'd read it 20 years ago. Better late than never.
Thank you, Simon. That's awesome. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I think, the other thing I suppose to say is just, because it is very clearly written and very clearly structured, that I think even people in a second language, and I'm thinking obviously of Japanese candidates, could easily read this. Any bilingual Japanese could easily get the key messages, if nothing else, just by reading the subtitles in bold and so on. So even if they don't read every word. So I think it's not only an English native audience that would benefit from this and could get the value from it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Simon. I really appreciate that.